Everyone to the installment of the restoration series Seeds to Success, our monthly webinar featuring experts and topics related to restoration in Idaho. My name is Eric Winford. I'm assistant professor of range ecology at the University of Idaho. I'm in Boise, and my co-host is Lauren King, extension educator in Benoit County. And today we have Dr. Tim Prather with us. Uh, Dr. Prather is a professor of plant sciences located in Moscow. He is also the senior associate director of the Rangeland Center. And Dr. Prather will be talking about restoration using native seed banks, and it's a pretty interesting topic. Tim and I have had a number of conversations about this over campfires and in the past, and I'm really interested to see what he's got to say about this and how we can be successful. How much patience do we really need for this, and how much luck? But
Yes.
yeah, without Tim, I'll just hand it off to you, and we'll be asking Tim to do a presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for some Q&A. So if you have any questions as Tim goes along, please do put those in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll answer them. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Eric and Lauren, for this opportunity. And I am going to talk about several different things. First of all, the restoration using native seed banks. And it can require some patience. And you can either call it luck or you can call it serendipity. Quite often, you have a lot of bad luck, but sometimes you do get lucky. I would like to take a few detours today as we go through the presentation. And I just want to also acknowledge that Lisa Jones has been instrumental in the work that we've been doing through the years. And so I want to recognize her contributions as well. So there's two ends of the spectrum here. If you take a look, some systems have limited disturbance, and they're going to be represented here. There's very little disturbance, whether it's grazing or some other flood event or something. And in those systems, they tend to rebound. And even if they have an invasion of invasive plants, if we remove those invasive plants, there's going to be a native seed bank that's going to allow for that system to rebound. But some systems are converted. They've been converted to another land use, or they've been used improperly in the past and have been invaded. And this right here happens to be an area that was completely overtaken by Ventonata dubia. So that entire field is it had been a Medusa head wild rye stand, and now it's predominantly a Ventonata stand. So when you take a look at these two ends of the spectrum, there's some things to be said for both of those. In both cases, there's patience that's involved, and there's some luck involved as well. So I'd like to take a little bit of a detour to address the situations where native seed banks really cannot be relied on. So one of the questions that you have to ask when you have disturbance and you're looking at prior to your seeding, what lies in wait for you, and what's going to come up and present problems for you. And so having some idea of what that is really important. So this, just to illustrate, here's an example of two different sites, and this is with yellow star thistle, looking at yellow star thistle density. And this is a site that's called Central Grade. It's at the top of the Clearwater Canyon, just outside of Lewiston, Idaho. And if you take a look, these are seedling densities, over 7,000 seedlings per square meter in this annual dominated plant community. There's an adjacent perennial plant community where there's virtually no yellow star thistle. But then you go to Julietta, and here you have a much lower, you have a little over 1,000 per square meter, but still quite a few. What this illustrates is that that they're both sites that are invaded by yellow star thistle. However, they have a very different situation with respect to the amount of seed in the seed bank and the ability of those weeds to come up and present a problem. So uh, we typically just don't have as good of an idea of what's going to be lying underneath that surface. So one of the things that I am involved in is working with people that are involved in Palouse Prairie restoration. And so I will get questions. I work quite a bit with the Soil Water Conservation District, and they're fantastic here in Latah County. And they work with landowners who are looking at conversion of areas or enhancing existing Palouse prairie remnants. It's the most endangered prairie in North America, and so I will get questions like these, and here's one. I have a new restoration planting, and I have sheep sorrel and red stem fillery taking over. So these restoration projects are usually going to involve uh, probably at least 5 to 10 forb species and probably 2 to 3 grasses. So the investment is considerable when those get going. And it's understandable that when someone's getting ready to start a project, that they're just really excited and they want to start the project, get it going, and begin to enjoy the fruit of their labor. But but the problem is that there's causes for failure, and those causes for failure are going to be both weather related, and then the other one is weeds. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here addressing that particular aspect, somewhat to weather, but weeds are really something that we have to deal with, and they are often the cause of failure to a restoration project. So patience really is important. If we really only deal with those weeds once, they're going to come right back, and they're going to get the best of you. So in this particular instance, where it was primarily sheep sorrel that was the first problem, and so now you have a situation where there's been a large investment in seed. There has not been sufficient weed management ahead of time. And so now you've got this particular perennial weed in the field, and it's causing problems with that native planting. And so regardless of what you look at using, there's going to be some collateral damage to that particular planting. So when we look at how we're going to deal with that, in this instance, we could look at a couple of options. Clarity, which is a broader spectrum herbicide, or Transline, which is fairly narrow. But both of these would have impacts on anything in the sunflower family or the legume family. And there's a number of other families that would be impacted by Clarity, but and Transline is a little bit more selective. So that's one aspect of it. And then red stem fillery escort is a possibility, or Clarity plus 2,4-D, but this is again a broader spectrum, and there's going to be greater damage. So it's better to deal with those problems ahead of time before we get into a situation where we have these problems develop ahead of time. So this is a shot of the Palouse Prairie in winter. This is actually out my window at my house. And when we look at these Palouse Prairie projects, we're typically looking at about 3 years of weed control before we even look at seeding, if it's a situation where there's a conversion from agriculture back to a prairie. And if If it's existing prairie, of course, in many instances, we can look at utilizing a native seed bank if it hasn't been too far disturbed. So anyway, let's take a look at situations where we don't have sufficient need for seed banks. And I do have an example for you of a project that was well done. So this is a Palouse Prairie project, and it's a 50-acre conversion back to prairie. So this is a multi-year process. So in the first year, it was mowed in October and then sprayed with glyphosate, which is Roundup. In the second year, there was a mid-May spray again with Roundup, and this is to take care of most of the plants that may be on the site. And it really has no residual, so you're looking at multiple applications if you take this route. So late June, it was sprayed again, and then again in late October. So really trying to address that seed bank as an issue. Then in the third year, it was sprayed midway with glyphosate and then another herbicide, triclopyr, which would get some of the broadleaves, some additional broadleaves that may not have been adequately controlled with the glyphosate. Then a late June application, and then it was finally seeded in October. And those herbicides would be either short or no residual, so they wouldn't cause a problem. So we typically are going to be doing fall seedings here, and then in that fourth year, there was just perimeter mowing to try to keep any weeds that are on the outsides from moving back into the site. And then the fifth year was sprayed with for annual grasses. You get annual grass control, but then also some red stem fillery control as well. So that gives you an idea of what really good setup is for one of these plantings. And these plantings, this particular one had about 15 to 20 different species that were in the seed mix. And so there was a huge investment initially. It was probably $800 to $1,000 per acre for this particular project in seed alone. So one of the things that you'll find is that we really do need weed control for restoration. It's really rare that we are in a situation where we can do a restoration project without addressing weeds. But the converse is also true. Restoration really is needed for weed control. Managing weed problems in rangelands and forest lands has been my career here at University of Idaho. And if you don't do anything to change the particular system, then you're just going to replace one weed with another one. And sometimes it's a worse one that comes in later. So we need to be looking at both of those, and whether it's restoration from the standpoint of trying to put back together a native plant community, or if you're looking at something that is just more of a perennial plant community that may or may not be something that's native, you're still going to need to have this both weed control and restoration or some kind of improvement in the plant community. This is just an example. So this was in yellow star thistle again in the canyon grassland system. So this is 5 years after seeding, and there were a bunch of other treatments. There were some herbicide treatments and some fertilization treatments. But 5 years after seeding, the only thing that showed a difference was if it was seeded or not seeded. So if we look at yellow star thistle and the kilograms per hectare, which would translate to pounds per acre, you see that there's a considerable amount of yellow star thistle coming back onto the site. It was only sprayed one time prior to us planting this. And then in the not seeded area, you can see that the yellow star thistle biomass is considerably greater. So if we hadn't done any seeding, we would have had considerably more yellow star thistle. So this is intermediate wheatgrass you could see that it has it is doing a whole lot better. Um, and this is what we're seeing here is in the unseeded area, we're seeing some Oahe intermediate wheatgrass actually creeping over into the plots that are adjacent to it. And then with the annual grasses, they're pretty much equivalent as well as the forbs. Just another example, this is on the Whitebird battlefield site, and there's multiple species that were planted here. This is a fescue planting here. It was established in the mid 1980s, and this particular picture was taken in 2019. And there's a number of species that would potentially invade here, yellow star thistle, and then a whole bunch of annual grasses, but they have been excluded from this site. So we can do a pretty good job of controlling our weedy species with perennial vegetation in many instances. So that's somewhat on the patience side of things, and now I'll just spend a minute or two on the serendipity side. This is a planting, more recent planting, and it is also at the Whitebird battlefield site. And this gentleman is over 6 feet tall, and you can see that there are some basin wild rye plants that are over his head, and then there's just a whole bunch of uh, native grasses in here. There's a blue bunch wheatgrass variety in here that's really taken off. And what happened was we had an extremely wet year, and it was just amazing the difference from the year prior when you could still walk through this fairly easily. This is so dense that it's not actually very easy to walk into that system, in that system there. So we just really got lucky and had an unusually high amount of rainfall. What I have here is a graph to show you. This is for an area pretty close to this location here. This is the annual precipitation. This is the average right here. And what you're seeing is that these are the deviations from that average. So here's several years that are above that average, and then years that are below the average. So you can see how it goes up and down. And here's a very dry year and a very wet year. So what can happen in some instances is we may go to establish a project, and it could be either utilizing the native seed banks, or it could be a seeded project. If we were to seed right here, now we've got years of below average moisture before we just have a couple above, and you can see the challenge that you would have here if serendipity was involved here, and you plant it here, boy, you'd have all these years of wet. And so establishment would be just about assured for this particular situation. So we do have to be lucky to some degree. There are some things that we can do to try to moderate this particular effect. There are some efforts underway to look at being able to be more predictive of this. You'll notice that there's a group of years that are above and then a group of years that are below, and you see that there's kind of a pattern there. Well, those are going to reflect the La Nina and El Nino precipitation patterns. So there's another type of serendipity that can come into play, and that is dealing with other problems that are pretty challenging, but then you realize that there's a way to deal with it. So this is a situation where we had an area that had a lot of this fern-leaf lomatium and just a wonderful stand of it, and coming into it was this non-native. This is burr chervil, and it's been replacing yellow star thistle. It has a wide ecological amplitude. It'll even go into salt desert shrub, as well as into um, situations where you have like hackberry in the draws in the canyon grasslands. So it can get into really wet areas and it can get actually pretty large. So our concern was that this was going to end up overtaking the fernleaf lomatium, and so how are we going to deal with it? Well, it turned out that this particular plant starts to grow in the late fall when the fernleaf lomatium has become dormant. And so even though this herbicide that was used, amber, would have killed this particular plant too, we used a low dose of it so that it would take out the fir chervil, but then it would be dissipated by the time this started to grow again in the spring. So sometimes we get lucky with just growth habits of particular species, and we're able to protect areas from further degradation. And then I just wanted to mention one more thing in terms of trying to look at developing a native seed bank. This is a situation where this is a restoration methods class that I teach. And one of the things we do is we grow these native plants, and then our class, and then we invite other people from the community to come and help plant these. And so we plant these restoration islands. And the idea here is that you get these plants growing, they produce seed, and then they can then be a source for moving out beyond those islands and start to move into those areas outside of these restoration islands. So building a seed bank on this particular site and then having seed move off. And if we take a look at some of those, they're also watered a little bit during the first season. You can see some of the establishment of some of our natives. And this is even in the first year of flowering. Of course, this is Clarkia, so it's an annual, it would flower anyway. So anyway, that was my detour, and now we'll get on to the rest of the topic, which is looking at native seed banks, and this would be in the sagebrush system. One of the things that we know is that these annual grasses in the sagebrush system are going to be a big issue, and there have been some thresholds that have been developed, and Lisa was very good about getting these thresholds from the literature. And so we have an increased fire risk at 10% of annual grasses. There's a decrease in native bunch grass abundance when we get to 15% cover, 15% of the ground covered. And then we can look at potential community state transition at 20. I think that these numbers would need to be moved a little bit higher in our wetter sagebrush areas like the one that we were working in. But what it does tell us is that we have some things to be pretty concerned about. And so if you have a fairly intact system, but your annual grass is increasing, then you really need to try to address it. So when we take a look at our particular situation in the untreated, it was 55% cover of annual grasses. And in that early period, indaziflam, which is one of the newer herbicides, Rejuvra, it's called Rejuvra. The active ingredient is indaziflam. But initially, it had about 14% annual grass cover, and when we combined it with imazapic, which is plateau, we got 7%. And the reason why this doesn't work as well in its first year is because of distribution of droplets onto the soil, and we're going to hopefully hammer that point home as we go through this presentation. So those are some of the concerns that we have and why we look at these types of projects. So this is the system that we're working in. It's at Rinker Rock Creek Ranch, and it's fairly high elevation, and so typically the heat the evaporative demand is not as great as it is when you get into the lower elevations. The precipitation is is um, is typically somewhere around this level, and if we look at over the course of the study, it was started in 2019, but if we look at 20, 21, 22, and 23, see 14 inches, 12 inches, and 16 inches of precipitation. Um, there's mountain big sagebrush, sandberg bluegrass, bunch wheatgrass. There's also Columbia needlegrass, and then over 40 different forb species. We utilized Rejuva at 5 ounces, which is the indaziflam, or Rejuva plus plateau at another 5 ounces. We look when you have the scope of the problem that we have, we just really can't do it by ground, and so you have to look at aerial application. And so with a herbicide like indaziflam, that really presents some challenges. So this is an area of fixed wing and then helicopter, and 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 then that was started in 2019, and we started taking our data after that. We used water sensitive paper to put that out prior to the application of the herbicides. And one of the things you can see here is if we look at droplet coverage, here's water sensitive paper. And so these are the droplets of the herbicide. And you can see that this would be an actual size of a cheatgrass seed with respect to this piece of paper. And you could see that in this location, there would not be any herbicide that would contact that particular seed. At 18% coverage, that seed is definitely going to be impacted. The challenge is that it's very difficult to get 18% coverage when you're looking at spraying at anywhere from 2.5 to 5 gallons of water per acre. And most applicators don't like to go as high as 5, but with this Rejuva, you really need it. So this is kind of the way in which those cards were laid out. And then we took our data along this. So what we found was that with this herbicide droplet coverage, if we had really low coverage, the average was still around 75% control, but you look at it anywhere from virtually zero control to 100% control. It really depended on where the droplets were. So you have a lot of variability. But once you got up around 7 and up, then that control is pretty much similar. So if you look at all the individual data points, they're much more concentrated around the line than they are here, where they have a wide range. So that's something that is really important. So we need at least 7% of the area covered in order to get good control. So when we look at data collection, we collected data across several years. This is in 2022, 23, and 24. But initially, we were looking at cover classes of individual species, and we were not looking at recruitment at that point. With Rejuva, it will pretty much stop recruitment, and it will stop annual species from being present on the site. So it'll start to deplete that seed bank in those first couple of years. It's active as seeds germinate and the roots are coming out. They come in contact with the herbicide, and it prevents cell walls from forming, and so you don't get growth of the seedling. What we were able to discern here is if we take a look at annual grass cover, and this was done later in this course of the study. But if you look at some of the cover for perennial grass, this is the line here, as annual grass cover increased, we had a decrease in perennial grass cover. If we looked at perennial forbs, we see that there's a decline there as well. And if we look at forbs that are important for greater sage grouse, we see again that those annual grasses are causing a decrease. So in all three groups of plants, we're seeing a decline as annual grass cover increases. And so this is why it's another reason why it's really critical for us to look at removing those annual grasses in addition to the fire risk. We're also avoiding a transition to another type of plant community. So we look at annual grass control from 2020 to 2022. Or we had annual grass control with indaziflam, but if we take a look at the average perennial grass cover during that time, we had an initial decline. So this is the untreated, but it declined and they were pretty much the same in 2021. And then they both increased in 2022. So we had an initial period of time where it looked like there was probably some stunting of the perennial grasses, but then they pretty much tracked the untreated after that. But we did have considerable amount of annual grasses in that system. If we look at the forb response, here you see if we add that in, you look at indaziflam, we're seeing in 2022, we're seeing a response in the forbs and not so much of a response in either of these. So we're getting some benefit from the herbicide application. And we're looking at forb cover. We're not looking at recruitment yet. So if we were to take a look at 2021, the native species richness, we had no differences at all in terms of in the untreated. You look at the average number of species, there's 11. In the treated, we had 10 species for looking at native species richness. So pretty much no additional effect after that initial decline. And if we take a look 3 years afterwards, we look at cheatgrass cover in the untreated. It's at 41 and the treated is at 6. So it has those herbicides are continuing to work, particularly and everywhere where we have the indaziflam in the treated area, it's doing pretty well. In terms of forb recruitment, it's looking about the same in this instance. So again, looks like we're having a situation where the treated areas have bounced back and they're doing as well as the untreated. So then what we did is in addition to looking at these cover classes, we also added in a recruitment class for density. We were starting to notice that there were plants coming back into the system. We had some annuals and some of our perennials were starting to see seedlings of them as well. So we wanted to take a look at assessing that within these frames. So I'm going to show you some data here in a minute, but 4 years after the treatment, we still had annual grass control, and we did get a response of perennial grasses, perennial forbs, and annual forbs. So we were starting to get some recruitment, and this is what that system looked like 4 years after. You can see that there's annual grasses here and none above. So 63% annual grass cover, 11% annual grass cover. We'll look first at the perennial grass response. Again, this is still looking at cover, and the importance here is that cover is really a measure of plant health and also then it tells us something about potential seed production down the road as those plants get larger and uh, and are successful, then they're able to produce seed as well. So what we see is a little bit higher cover in the treated plots. If we were to look at herbicide droplets in those treated areas, deep-rooted perennials tended to they tended to respond to that, and we see that the lack of competition from the annual grasses is benefiting those perennials. What we found with Sandbrook bluegrass was really interesting. If we had indaziflam by itself, we saw this positive response, but we saw a negative response if we had plateau in the mix. And there are instances in other systems where bluegrasses are negatively impacted by plateau. So we were initially kind of puzzled by this, but we see that it's likely because of that susceptibility to plateau. We did another study in Washington, and we did not see the same response. We did see a negative response to the plateau in that instance. So if we look at native perennial forb cover, we see that we're getting higher cover now, 64% cover in treated plots, 45% in the untreated. So there's a difference there. And these perennial forbs are also responding to this droplet coverage. And so that shows that they're also responding to the lack of annual grasses. As we increase that droplet coverage, our annual grass control is better. And now we see with our native annual forb cover, we're now seeing that they're basically the same. The ones that were not treated have a slightly higher amount, but the variability in those measurements were such that they were not detectable from each other. And we're no longer seeing an impact of herbicide droplets coverage on that particular site. If we look at preferred forb cover, so this would be a subset of those forbs, what we're seeing is that in the treated, that we do have higher cover of that. And we also have some additional research that Kirby Lau, who's on today, she found that greater sage grouse were utilizing these areas more. And so that's reflected here. And among the treated plots, the droplet coverage still is somewhat influential. So the greater sage grouse forb cover, preferred forb cover is also responding to that droplet coverage. So this is something that's likely going to be important for us to think about in terms of writing contracts, is to say we'd like to be sure that we have at least a 7% droplet coverage so that we have really good response, both from a control standpoint, but also a forb and perennial grass response. So now we'll get to seed bank recruitment. So this is that patience thing where we were looking at several years, a couple years without recruitment, and then building to a point where we could start to detect that there actually was starting to get some recruitment. If we take a look at just recruitment overall in 2023, this is the last year that we collected data, we had 46 native total forbs and shrub species. There were 32 that were preferred forb species. In 2022, that number was less. There were only 21. So we added 11 species in that year. So greater recruitment through time. There was an average of 9 species. There were 6 native species in each individual plot in treated ones, and and there were 5 native in the non-treated. So there were more species here in the non-treated, but they may have been species that we were wanting. Some of them would have been species that we would have wanted to control. We take a look at native species richness. We find that our native species richness was actually greater in the treated area, 3.6 versus 2.4. So among those treated plots, we didn't see at that point there was no effective droplet coverage anymore. So that was interesting. But I think what we are seeing is a legacy effect where the seed bank was depleted for the annual grasses, and so we are still benefiting from that. So we look at comparing that 2022 recruitment to 2023. We added 22 more species of forbs. 10 of them were greater sage-grouse preferred. And this occurred whether it was in the treated area or the untreated. We were seeing the same thing happening in our treated areas and our untreated areas. But we did have an average of 3 more species per plot and greater density of them as well. So then in summary, what we're finding is that we've got good annual grass control with indaziflam and indaziflam plus imazapic. So this is Rejuva plus Plateau. And with both of those herbicides, that first year we get better annual grass control because of the challenges with droplet distribution and its importance for indaziflam. I think at this point it was started in 2019, and we're looking at 2023, 2024. Those we can still see the effects of that. When you get to the edges of plots, you can still see that there's lower annual grass. I think it's a legacy effect. The annual grass seed bank had been depleted. What we're finding is with indaziflam that higher herbicide droplet coverage does result in better control. We see native perennial grass cover improve through the years, and the preferred forb cover also increases. And as we get larger plants of both of those, the potential for seed set, of course, also goes up, and so that what we may see is through time that we reap additional benefits from that higher perennial grass and preferred forb cover. We did find also that higher annual grass cover was correlated to lower perennial grass, perennial forb, and greater sage-grouse preferred forb cover. So removing those annual grasses, even though it may have had some initial challenges, removing those was important. It did benefit all those groups with respect to percent cover. We also found that the herbicides have not impeded the natural recruitment, and that greater native plant cover will likely result to continued seed bank input. And so that's another part of that patience part, is that we're likely to continue to see improvements in the system. The other caveat that we want to put out there is that this is a higher moisture system, and so recruitment in general is going to be a little easier because of that. And so when we get into the Wyoming big sage, drier, hotter sites, the differences may be more pronounced between the treated and untreated areas, just because of that difference in the potential for recruitment. We really, by the time we were done, we're not seeing, you're seeing increased cover of these important species. But in terms of recruitment, it was pretty similar in the treated and the untreated. So I think that at that point, say thank you. And then if you do have some questions, I certainly be interested in trying to answer them for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate that. And we do have a few questions here, and others, if as we start answering them, please add in some questions to the chat. Starting off, in your seed mixes, how many biennials and annuals were included in the mixes, and what percentage of the mix was annual biennial? I think this was earlier in the
Okay,
game.
so in that earlier, and those would be the Palouse Prairie restoration
Hmm.
projects. There could be anywhere from 6 to 15 forb species in those mixes, and then there would be 2 to 3 grasses. The majority of them would be perennial. We are starting to look at some annuals. The one that seems to be on everyone's radar for producing is Clarkia, and
Hmm.
and it seems to do really well. It's got high germinability, high seed output. So I think it's going to be a good one. In terms of what's interesting is we don't we don't have as many annual annual forbs that have been looked at for use in restoration, and so that's going to be an increasing area of interest. We do have Oregon Sunshine is a perennial, but it almost acts like an annual. It establishes really well. It flowers its first year. We see it increase with disturbance, and then once other species start to get established, it starts to decline. So, so I think it's one that we like to see in the mix. And then having, even though a lot of these areas are not really very suitable sandbird bluegrass habitat, um, sandbird bluegrass is one that establishes well, and it may decline through time, but it's another one that's somewhat acts like an annual, but as a perennial. So hopefully that answers that question.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Some questions in the chat now. Is droplet contact necessary with indaziflam? Um, Understanding was that action depended on mobilization in the soil.
Yeah, so those droplets are hitting the soil. So when we have our water sensitive paper, that's on the soil surface, or just above whatever plants are there. So it's not so much that it's contacting the annual grasses themselves.
Mm,
It's that it's getting to the soil, and then if it's not going to move very much from where it lands in that first year. So in order to move side to side, it does starts to do that in that second year. Um, and these herbicides, particularly the Rejuvera Dazaflam, it's going to be applied prior to uh, germination of the annual grasses. If they have germinated, then we get very poor control of that first fall with indaziflam. That's where the plateau does help out because it will have some post-emergent activity as well. So that's why that's a pretty good mix. It tends to buffer against some potentially negative effects if
okay.
you guess wrong.
Um, how long after indaziflam treatment until you can expect to see native recruitment?
Well, I think we really started to see it after about 3 years. We're starting to notice it, and so we then started to measure it. In our first year, um, there were a couple of the native forbs that had been present prior to application and were not present after application in those first couple years. But then we started to see them coming back in on the site in that third and fourth year. after application.
Okay. And as part of the baseline, were any soil bioassays conducted to get an idea of soil seed bank composition?
Yeah, we did not do soil seed bank um, sampling. That certainly would have strengthened this particular study. We also would would not have had enough resources to really explore that particular area for this size of a project with as large of an area as we had that we were treating.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would have been really nice to know ahead of time what was there.
All right. Okay. A bunch of questions. We'll try to get to them all. Um, how do we ensure higher droplet coverage specifically to get to the greater than 7% in our treatments? You mentioned including more water in the mix.
Well, if you take a look at the label, I think it pretty much says you want to have 5 gallons of water as a carrier. And then if one of the things that I'm not really attuned to is the technology from aircraft on how they can look at distribution of their droplets. There are a number of both chemical products and then also nozzles and nozzle arrangements that they can utilize uh, to to affect distribution of droplets. And so um, I get our our caution is that uh, just knowing that you have 5 gallons per acre does not necessarily mean that you're going to get that nice uniform distribution of droplets on the ground. So because that has an impact, it would be kind of nice to know ahead of time how someone's going to get to that droplet. And if somebody could do it with 3 gallons, but they can get that distribution on the ground, then that would be just fine. What we were finding is that if we were to look at the amount of water as a carrier as it increased, we would find that about 7 gallons would have been really good. Um, but 5 is still pretty good, particularly if you are using plateau. The plateau really buffers against some of the challenges with distribution. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from applying if they're just limited to 5 gallons of carrier per acre. It's just something that it, if you can have that kind of a discussion with your applicator and know what their distribution is, it just gives you that much more information.
Okay. Um, a couple more native plants or native forbs discussions and seeds. Here's one. What about Helianthus annuus, annual sunflower, I believe? Any experience with that? Seems like a real potential annual workhorse.
Yeah, I have not worked with that one at all. Uh, yeah, there are going to be some species that would be really interesting to look at, and I think uh, if we can get one of the challenges is is in the production of them. And I'm not suggesting that it's hard for Helianthus annuus. You may be able to harvest that just fine. There's a number of species that we just will never see. One of the challenges that we have is that you're looking at having to harvest these, and these are all indeterminate, so they're shedding seed. They're not like our crops, which are bred to shatter at the same time so that you harvest them and you get pretty much all the seed. Um, these are 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 plants that uh, some of that seed's not going to be mature, some of it is, some of it's already dropped to the ground. And then when you try to clean that seed, there are some species where, for example, one of the natives that we have here, it's one of my favorites, is prairie smoke, and it's got plumes on it. Um, and the way they were harvesting that was they used a leaf blower, and you can reverse the engine so it sucks rather than blows. And they were vacuuming the areas, uh, and that's you just can't do that on a large scale. Um, I would guess that Helianthus annuus would be a fairly easy one to harvest. You'd have to set a header up a little higher, which would be fine. That would be easy. It'd be desirable to do, and so that you decrease the amount of plant material that's going through the harvester. But it should be one that could get into culture pretty easily, I would think.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and then for folks who are interested in native seeds, do we have any resources for that? I think Lauren, you might know too if we have some resources available for folks.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a number of them. If you're looking at private sources, Rainier Seed in Washington has quite a number of annual, or not annual, but quite a number of native seeds. And then the Clearwater Seed here in in the local area around Moscow. There's quite a few native native seed growers that all market their seed through Clearwater Seed. And there's others as well, but those are two that I'm fairly familiar with.
Okay. Let's see some more specifics here. Any correlation between precipitation after the application and the effectiveness of the indaziflam herbicide?
Well, I think if you get higher amounts of moisture, you may move those droplets around a little bit more. So yeah, higher moisture would be fine. The other thing that would do is it may result in uh, greater germination of the annual grasses, and so that you deplete that seed bank more rapidly. One of the things that I didn't include is that when you take a look at the average seed life, so let's say it's 8 years or 10 years for cheatgrass. That that does not mean that over the course of 8 years, it's uh, the same viability. It's going to be um, what we're going to see when we're looking at the seed bank. Um, that's going to start to deplete in those first 2 years dramatically. So it's a steep decline in the first 2 or 3 years, and then it levels off. So in the first few years, we see a rapid decline in seed bank, and then if you were able to come back and spray a different herbicide later that was more short residual and knock back that annual grass even more, let's say at year 5, you would really do a nice job, and you wouldn't necessarily impact your native seed bank at that point.
Okay.
So yeah, there are some strategies for how to deal with it. In some instances, where where we have pretty significant impact of annual grasses, where it's 50-60% of the surface, I would not use Rejuvera first. I would use other herbicides that are shorter residual, and look at trying to see if you get some native plant response with that. And if not, then look at seeding, and then wait until uh, after a few years and you've got some recruitment establishment if you had to seed, and then come back with Rejuver at that point. So in our situation, it made sense to use the Rejuva. We weren't going to have large areas basically barren from anything. But there are instances on another study site, we've got some areas where there was a lot of vetnata, and it's basically been bare for 2 or 3 years. So that's a caution.
Well, I know we hit the hour, but we still have a handful of questions left. Do you have more time to spend with us, Tim?
Yeah, I've got a few minutes if people wanted to stick
Okay,
around, sure.
okay, cool. I'll try to get through some of these questions and then um, get through them. Okay, so here's a two-parter. It's how might you incorporate use of any climate weather forecasting and decision support tools? And is it better to wait to seed in poor precipitation forecast years and continue weed control, or to seed once seed bank is depleted as and take your chances?
Yeah, so there are some efforts out there that uh, Matt Termino made me aware of that I need to go back and look at. There has been some progress made on being better than a coin toss on whether it's going to be a good year or a bad year. And if we can get better than a coin toss, then I think that's a really good thing. Um, we we utilized that graph that I showed you, and we tried to look at what are the odds of uh, if you had 2 year if you had a if you looked at 2 years and it was a downward facing line versus 2 years that were an upward facing line,
Mhm.
what was the probability of the next year being either a good or a bad year? And I need to revisit that a little bit, but the first try we had at that, we just really could not get better than a coin toss with that. Even though you can see that there are patterns, there were some years where it oscillated up and down. But I think if you get a real high, um, if you're that next within 2 years, that's probably not going to be very good. If you're at a real low, you might want to wait a couple years and then it's going to be good. Um, but it's a real challenge for that. But I, I'm going to devote some time to looking at that, and hopefully later maybe we can do something through the center with one of our bulletins or white papers. Eric, maybe we could address that there.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great idea. Well, I know folks are jumping off. I do want to say that we have this will be put on our Range on Center's YouTube site. I'll send out an email for that. And we have another talk March 26th on restoring native Palouse Prairie um, that Lauren King will be leading up. Um, let's see, we got maybe one more question. Would you recommend additional seeding to increase perennial recruitment on a project area where herbicide treatment is also being conducted?
Sometimes that works just fine. It really depends on the herbicide. So if you were to take a look at a lot of the uh, prairie tall mid and tall grass prairie restoration projects, they use plateau a lot, and there's a lot of native species that are completely tolerant to it. Um, so it really depends on what you're planning on seeding when you what I look at is first of all, are there any members in that plant family that are on the on the list of species controlled, and then I go to the genus, and if there are plants in the same genus and they're perennial and you're looking at perennials, then I would say maybe that's not the best choice for you. So that's kind of how I use it. I'll go to the herbicide label and see what's controlled, what weedy species are controlled, and then just look at um, how closely related are the plants that I'm interested in trying, and is it is it something that I might have a problem with? There have been instances in the past when companies would bring a bunch of people together and then ask them uh, whether or not various native species are impacted or not. And we've done studies like that where they wanted to know, does it injure, you know, this complement of native plants? And we've done studies for chemical companies to show that whether they are safe or not. Uh, so it really kind of depends,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, no one strategy to rule them all, is there? Well, um, thanks for so much for your
Yeah.
expertise and time here.
Well, I
Um,
appreciate people tuning in for it, and it was a lot of fun for me to participate in it.
yeah, well, definitely. And reach out if you have other questions, and we'll try to get them answered. Really appreciate it all, and tune in for our next session, March 26th.
All right. See y'all
All right,
later.
take care.